we had heard that the environment was really treacherous in the northeastern part of the mountains. We had read books about it. We had watched videos. We heard about what happened to the Russians, but honestly, I didn't know what to expect. Coming from Fort Carson, I figured it would be somewhat the same, but it's just completely different. I mean, those valleys, they really do know how to, just cut deep into you. I had trained with Third Squad for my entire time at Fort Carson. I deployed knowing that I was going to be a part of Third Squad. And when my platoon leadership pulled me to the side, because Afghanistan is such a non-contiguous battlefield, there's no definitive front line, and everyone was just kind of being spread thin. We only had one platoon medic, and my lieutenant and platoon sergeant told me that I was gonna go with Second Squad up north to FOB Bostic, and I was gonna have to serve as their medic, and I didn't really know how to take it. At first, being immature, I thought maybe I was being outcasted and they didn't want me around, but they were looking at the bigger picture, for the mission, and I didn't know what to think. I'd never worked on anybody medically. I'd never really saw any major injuries in my life, and I wasn't really expecting really anything. And I got thrown into it right away. I worked in the aid station. I did shifts at night. I'd go out on mission as the medic. And I saw all sorts of different types of casualties, from Americans to local nationals. I worked on a total of 116 casualties. 21 of them died under my care. And I mean, it was rough. It was real rough. At that age, I didn't know how to process it, but I had some good NCOs in the aid station who knew that this wasn't my organic MOS, and they really helped me out through the whole process. And it was because of them that kind of led to my confidence going into the battle in Saw Valley. So we'd gotten done with a 3-day convoy logistics patrol. It was pretty quiet, and we'd gotten back to base and bedded down for 3-4 hours of sleep. And on the morning of September 10th, we got woken up to go down south and pick up a vehicle that was, I guess, broken down or shot up or something, and the mechanics needed to work on it. And it was supposed to be a quick 35-minute mission. We got the truck hooked up, and we're going to call back to FOB Bostic so that we could head back to base. And we got told to put the vehicle back, and that the platoon that it wasn't our organic platoon, but we were attached to 361 Cav Hatchet Platoon. And Hatchet Platoon was in Saw Valley conducting some form of operation, I think a recon operation. And they were in the vicinity of the Zingibosha Draw. And Saw Valley and Saw Village was a very well-known kinetic area because, at the time Bin Laden was alive, and this was his one of his safe houses. And so it was always, heavily armed. And so we turned the trucks around and we headed back into Saw Valley. And when we approached Hatchet Platoon on the road, we were confronted with a jingle truck, and as our vehicles pulled towards it, there was an enemy RPG team up to the right, and the driver did what he was told, and he pushed the vehicle out of the way, and the vehicle tumbled off of the cliff edge into the river, and I think 50 or 60 of these 155 rounds came out the back. Thankfully, none of them exploded. And as we linked up with the Hatchet Platoon, there was a First Sergeant Wallace was asking for volunteers to go up the mountain, and I was the only private on ground at that time. The rest of them were all NCOs, and my 4 team leaders, Sergeant Keel, Corporal Sisto, Sergeant Lee, and Sergeant Michigan, they all volunteered to go up, and that really gave me the courage to want to go and render my medical services to whoever needed it. And so I told them I'd go too, and that's when I went to go back to the truck to grab my aid bag, and First Sergeant told me, it's gonna be a quick snatch and grab mission. He just got told they're about 200 meters up this mountain, and we needed to hurry up. And I remember I followed First Sergeant and Corporal Sisto on the mountain, and no more than 50 feet onto the mountain face, we started taking sniper fire from Saw Village, and it was just a Spartan race just to get up the hill at that point. We just got up, zigzagged in and out of terrain until we got to about the 200-meter mark. And when we radioed up to the guys, the static wasn't as frequent because of the mountainous terrain. And we told them, hey, we're at the 200-meter mark. Like, where are you guys? And they said negative. We said 2000, and it ended up being 2000. Once we heard that, it was a lot farther than what we were originally told or thought. Me being the only private of the 8 that were going up there, I immediately became just concerned, naturally, because of my inexperience to combat and situations like this. And my leaders they didn't look phased, and they were just trying to knock down the next objective, looking at the way forward. And we moved our way up on the right side of the mountain, and we got into these Terrence cornfields. And I remember we got into about, I think, the third one, and I took a knee next to Sergeant Egan, the platoon sergeant. And he was fumbling around with the radio, and he looked at me, and I had really chapped lips. I could tell I was hurting from trying to get up that mountain. And because we didn't have any water or anything, he reached into his vest, and he had a water bottle. And as he did, he gets a call over the radio that we had one KIA, or one hero, came over the net, indicating that we had an American that had been killed in action, and he was trying to listen, and I couldn't really hear with everyone moving around. And I asked him, like, who got killed, and he said it was my lieutenant.
Roger, back. This is Hitman. Please go ahead.
Maybe water?
Yeah, Roger. Just let you guys know. Casualty that is...
That's supposed to start kill.
His only cover right now is our KIA. He is wide out in the open, and that's who the sniper has the six on. They both dropped down at the same time to try and get some concealment.
And I felt horrible because, I'm only 18. I at this point in life, I don't really know how to process death. But even then, this is his battle buddy. This is his friend, who he was just informed was killed. More of his soldiers up on the mountain are wounded, and he's trying to go rescue them. And his first act as a leader was to take care of me. And he reached out and he gave me, his nearly spent water, just so he could keep me going. And I didn't understand how someone had that type of mental fortitude, and how he remained so strong in that scenario. And before I could, give him any remorse or say anything to him, First Sergeant was trying to push us up into the next cornfields. And as we climbed up into the last one, I followed Corporal Sisto up a tree, and I threw my weapon over the ledge to the Terrence cornfield. And there was a sniper round that had come to the top of the corn stalks, and we started hearing footsteps in the cornfield. And First Sergeant radioed up and asked him if it was any of the Americans, and it wasn't. So we realized that we had enemy forces maneuvering within our formations. And as we got up and we pushed more to the right, we got up to this donkey trail. It was just a man-made trail that had a rock wall, and it was our last piece of cover and concealment that we had before we could get to the rest of the Americans. And I remember I was feeling super tired at this point. We had worked so hard to get to where we were, and we were still parallel to the casualties, but 200 meters away. And I could see Lieutenant Parton's body in the open about 175 meters in the middle of this draw. And this draw was covered by 3 angles of multiple snipers, and they were waiting for our team to come into the kill zone. When I was sitting on the donkey trail, I kind of felt useless. I didn't know how I could contribute to what was going on. First Sergeant Wallace and Sergeant Egan were trying to figure out how we were going to be able to get out into the open, extract LT's body as well as the other wounded and the other 2 squads, without taking fire, or at least accurate fire from the snipers. And I just felt useless, like I wasn't really contributing to the team, and I had to think about what I was there for, which was to be a medic. And because I didn't have an aid bag or any major medical supplies, I asked all the leaders to dump all their individual first aid pouches and give me all their stuff. So they started to throw everything at my feet, and I started to triage the medical equipment on my persons. I put tourniquets in one cargo pocket, Israeli dressings in another, and I told them if I go down for any reason, take it off my body and use it, for whoever needs it. And from what I was gathering was they wanted to drop a smoke mission to conceal our movement from the snipers. Problem was, because of the elevation and where the snipers were located, the smoke from a 155 wasn't going to disperse and high enough in elevation, but Willie Pete would. And Willie Pete, being white phosphorus, burning for so long, provides us a little bit longer on the smoke mission to extract them. But because it burns so hot and the air, if you breathe it, that some of that smoke in it could, really mess you up. It was very dangerous because it was going to be a danger close smoke mission, because you couldn't drop it too far above the snipers and too close onto LT's body and the other two groups. So they did a really good job at getting the smoke mission landed exactly where we needed it to be. And when the smoke hit, I remember Sergeant Egan and Corporal Sisto yelling at everyone to get up and go. And I followed my team leader, Sergeant Keel, and we just ran out into the open. There was no real trail. It was just a bunch of rock piles and formations of vegetation, and we jumped from pile to pile, and we just ran about 125 meters or so. And the snipers knew what we were doing, and they were shooting through the smoke to, hopefully get a lucky shot on one of us. And I followed my team leader until he got to the top of this boulder, wide out in the open, and he almost tripped over this Afghan army guy who was shot. I don't know if it was an exit wound from a 7.62 or if he took a small piece of shrapnel from an RPG, but I just remember seeing a pool of blood all over the boulder, and I took a knee next to him, and I felt something poke my thigh, which was his femur, and it was broken in half. He had a compound fracture, and he had a huge exit wound, and he was going into shock. No one could get out to help him because he was in the wide open, so I stayed out in the open with him, and I applied a tourniquet. I started shoving gauze into his leg and packed it with an Israeli dressing. And as I was doing this, the Kiowas came in for gun runs. We didn't know this, but there were Taliban groups maneuvering around us, and they were waiting for our rescue team to come in, and they were going to try and close us into the draw. And as I packaged him up, that's when Corporal Sisto and Sergeant Keel brought Lieutenant Parton's body over, and they collapsed next to me, and I was going to go over to LT and look and help for the first time, but that's when I looked off to my left and I saw these two bloody hands reach up onto this boulder, and it was Sergeant Russ. Looking at the hands, I didn't know who it was, so I swung around to the boulder, and I saw this long blood trail, and it was Sergeant Russ who, he dragged himself for I don't know how far, and he was on his stomach, so I rolled him over, and he was crying, he was in pain, and I felt horrible at that age. I had a couple dozen casualties under my belt at that point, but most of them had all been in the aid station, not under fire, in a situation like this. And, he was in full gear. He was putting himself in more pain. And I saw the major hemorrhaging coming from his leg. So that's obviously what I went for first. And he had applied 2 tourniquets, I think on himself. And because of him dragging himself, one of them had come undone. So I turned him over and I slammed down onto his femoral artery, and I started to tighten his tourniquet. And in doing so, I could hear him like choking, what it sounded like gargling. And after I was done tightening, I looked at his face, and he was choking on his own blood, and he had gotten shot partially in the mouth, and it had ripped off some of his mouth area and his tongue. And I had to kind of grab his tongue, tell him to bite down on it so he wouldn't suffocate. And I was trying to get him up, but my smaller stature, being 5'8", he's like 6'2", 3", he's like 250 pounds without gears. He's just a big monster of a dude. And I had a hard time trying to get him up and get him back to the donkey trail without putting him in more pain. And Sergeant Keel and Corporal Sisto saw this, so they came over and they grabbed him from me. But then there wasn't anybody to grab LT. So I volunteered to grab LT's body, and out of respect for the family, I'm not really going to describe what he looked like and stuff like that, but I grabbed his shoulder of his uniform, and I started dragging him back to the donkey trail, and I was trying to be as respectful as you could in a moment like that. and in doing so, I was being very slow, and the first sergeant started yelling at me to hurry because the smoke was starting to clear. And so I did everything I could. I used every bit of adrenaline in my body to pull him back, and I collapsed next to him on the donkey trail. And I remember inhaling a huge chunk of dirt, coughing, and I remember looking at LT's face, and I just felt horrible. I didn't know what to say or do, and I thought at this point there was no way we were getting down the mountain without paying a bigger price. And my leaders, they were confident. They were formulating the next plan, and they were already redistributing ammo and gear. And First Sergeant wanted to split us up into 3 groups. First Sergeant, myself, Sergeant Lee, a Cav Scout, and interpreter were the first 5 to go and recon a route down the mountain. And the way we had come up the mountain was too treacherous for the wounded to go down, so we had to find a new way. The middle group would consist of all the Afghans. Because of the language barrier, we wanted to keep them in the middle so they could follow us. And then the last group was going to carry all the other wounded and then LT's body. And that's when I knew I wasn't ever going to see LT again. And so I kind of took a moment to say goodbye, and I didn't know how to process it. And when we started to push down the mountain, it was dark at this time, and Murphy's Law, night vision goggles weren't working. The moonlight was barely visible, and the convoy couldn't see our infrared chem lights. Nothing was working, and our methods of finding a route down the mountain were to kick rocks off of ledges, and if it was 3 feet or 30 feet, that's how we determined which way we were going to fall off and go each time. And it was slow progress, but it was good. We weren't taking fire anymore at this point. And we were maybe halfway down the mountain when there was a bright white light shining in between my legs. And I looked back, and there was an Afghan army soldier who was using his white flashlight, and he exposed our entire position. And First Sergeant told me to turn around and tell him to turn the flashlight off. And I got maybe 2 steps in, and the entire solid village just lit us up. And I remember collapsing to the ground and sliding down this embankment with First Sergeant in between my legs. And I remember just being pinned down and not moving. And I started to black out. I think I was reaching heat exhaustion at this point. And the last thing I remember was First Sergeant yelling into the radio, Broken Arrow, indicating that we were on the verge of, being overwhelmed, and we just were piling up more wounded at this point, and, people were getting hurt, and we needed air assets to get us off this mountain. I don't know how much time had passed, being blacked out, but when I woke up, it felt like my body was being pelted with rocks. And with my back on the ground facing the sky, there was a Kiowa helicopter silhouetted above us, and he was shooting his gun, and it was his brass that was falling onto our body, and that was what woke me up, and sound and sight started to slowly come back. And I remember looking up to my right and seeing a C-130 Spectre gunship, and it was raining down onto the adjacent mountain. And I looked up to my left, and there was an Afghan soldier, the same one using the white flashlight, and he came over the boulder, looked up, and took 2 bullets to the torso head area and fell. And he was caught in between 2 boulders, his leg was, and I couldn't get to him without completely exposing myself. And I felt horrible as a medic. I couldn't get to a casualty, and I felt just useless. And I was yelling to the Afghans to grab him on the way down. And that's when I looked to the right, and I saw a big red-orange ball come flying at us. And it was a Russian-made B-10 recoilless rifle, rocket. And it slammed into the rock wall just on the other side. And the entire area was peppered with shrapnel. And where I was, the rock wall had gotten collapsed and fell down and partially dislocated my shoulder. And First Sergeant had had enough of the position and told us to start moving down. And he was going to go link up with the last group. So Sergeant Lee and myself started maneuvering down, and we slid down this embankment, and Sergeant Lee followed me. And I had already been carrying I think 5 or 6 different M4s from the wounded to, kind of lessen their burden. And Sergeant Lee hit a rock and it came down to my already wounded shoulder, and I was completely out. I couldn't move. The pain was just too much for me to handle. And being the medic, I had to walk him through how to put my shoulder back into place, which he was doing all under fire. And he had picked me up and put me against this boulder for stability. And, rounds were coming in and they were hitting the boulder and nearby Sergeant Lee's feet. And he tried resetting it, but he just couldn't do it. And, with the rounds coming in, I just told him to use the buttstock of his rifle. And so he slammed the buttstock into my shoulder 3-4 times until it went back into place, and it kind of got me on my feet. And as Sergeant Lee and I made our way down, F-16s came on station and dropped 2 500-pound GBUs, and which is good, but it suppressed a lot of the enemy. But the entire area was illuminated, and Saw Village saw me and Sergeant Lee crossing this open field, and they started lighting us up, and that's when Sergeant Lee and I got separated. I don't know where I think he had fallen down the mountain some bit. I got pushed off to the right, and I had to tuck away in between 2 boulders until the fire ceased towards us. And I started marking chem lights on the way down. I made my way down by myself, and I got to the bottom of the mountain, and I linked up with my squad leader, Sergeant Brown, and I let him know that I was there for accountability purposes. But that's when I looked towards the front of the convoy, and I saw a lone American walking by himself. And me and my boy Patsky, we walked over, and there were still some rounds coming in from Saw Village, and I just remember seeing this American walking towards us, and it was a silhouette. You could tell it was American based off his gear, and his chin strap was undone, his vest was wide open, and he was literally dragging his rifle into the ground. And it was Corporal Sisto, as he got closer, and he came over to me and Patsky, and he collapsed in our arms. And I put him up against the tire well, and I started to blood sweep him. I'm checking to make sure he's not hit because he just didn't look right. And, he had that 1,000-yard stare, and I didn't know what was wrong. I tried asking him questions and stuff, and he didn't have a response. He didn't want to talk, and so I put him in the vehicle. And, it wasn't until days later I finally talked to him, and, during that initial barrage of enemy fire, he had gotten pushed off the mountain to the left, and he couldn't get back up to us. And I guess in doing so, he heard some dude speaking Pashto, and he thought it was the Afghan army guys, but it wasn't. It was Taliban trying to maneuver between our elements, and they'd gotten 15-20 feet from him, and he had to ditch his gear and hide off some rock piles until they had left the area. And so I know he was real messed up for that for a while. And so after this was all done, I got back into my truck, and I was tired. I was dehydrated. I sat in the back. I took my helmet and gear off and tried to decompress. And I could not have imagined or wanted the day to end in any other way. As I reached down, my gunner was messing around with the Mark 19 ammo cans and knocked over all the water bottles. And I picked up the first one and took a swig, and it was my piss bottle from earlier that day. That I just happened to throw in the back. And I could not have imagined that day ending any other way at that point. Once we mounted back up into the truck, I drove the vehicle back. Sergeant Keel, my team leader, didn't really know the situation with my shoulder. I didn't really tell him. I told him mid-drive, and I was already driving with one arm, and he told me that he was going to take me directly to the aid station as soon as we got back. And Sergeant Keel drove the vehicle straight past, no ground guide, right to the aid station, got me to there as fast as he could. And I remember opening the door to the aid station. I was carrying my weapon in my left arm, and I remember seeing to my left, Lieutenant Parton's body was placed to the side with the blanket over him, and the aid station was just going crazy. Medics were running all over to tend to the other wounded, and that's when Sergeant Moore had, he was a really big mentor of mine as a medic, and he had come up to me and he had saw that, I guess I didn't look right, and he, asked what was wrong. I told him that, I was hit and my body had just given out and I collapsed, and the severity and the seriousness and the emotional toll of it all just started to rush through all at once. And they dragged me off into one of the side rooms and they ripped my gear and clothes off of me and started to tend to me. And although that day was extremely traumatic for me, I don't regret it. I'm super glad that I went up the mountain, that I did something, that I volunteered with my team leaders, and a lot of that day was a foundation or a building block for my leadership style and how I carried myself. And I applied a lot of what I learned that day to my second deployment during the Battle for Blessing.